Good morning and welcome to Let the Bible Speak. My name is Alex Meredith, the preacher for the Marquette Church of Christ. Glad to be with you today and thank you for tuning in. We are in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20 is the text we're going to be covering today. We're continuing this series through Matthew's Gospel, looking at the story of Jesus. And this passage that we're going to be covering today is really pivotal in the book itself, in the Gospel of Matthew. It's kind of this hinge point that separates the first half from the second half. But I also think that this passage just in general is a really, really important passage for our modern and, dare I say it, postmodern culture. So, Jeremiah chapter 21, verses 5 through 7. Jeremiah, an Old Testament prophet to Judah, 600 years before the days of Jesus, he delivers this really dangerous prophecy to the king of Israel at the time. His name was Zedekiah. Listen to what he says. He's relaying the words of God to the king. I myself will fight against you with outstretched hand and strong arm, and anger and in fury and in great wrath. And I will strike down the inhabitants of this city, both man and beast. They shall die of great pestilence. Afterward, declares the Lord, I will give Zedekiah, king of Judah, and his servants, and the people in this city who survived the pestilence, sword, and famine, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of their enemies, into the hand of those who seek their lives. He shall strike them down with the edge of the sword. He shall not pity them, or spare them, or have compassion. This did not make Jeremiah a very popular man. In fact, Jeremiah is notorious for being persecuted because of the messages that he relays from God to Israel's royalty. Now, 600 years later, by the time we get to Matthew chapter 16, Jesus is very much perceived as this Jeremiah-esque public figure. Okay? And it's causing some rising temperatures, let's say, within his ministry. He's starting to make enemies. Now, he didn't go out of his way, that was not his intent. He came into the world to save it, but by consequence of saying the truth, and sometimes speaking hard truths that people did not want to hear, he ended up making some enemies. And there were people that were seeking his life and either looking to arrest or have him killed in some cases. So at this point, in Matthew 16, he makes this tactical retreat up to Caesarea Philippi, just outside the Promised Land to the northeast. And Caesarea Philippi is this desert oasis of sorts, kind of carved partly into the Rocky Mountains in the area. It's a really rocky area, which actually becomes important later. But let's go ahead and read this. This is in Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 30. And you'll have to excuse me, I forgot to have my Bible ready, so that'll give you a chance to turn there as well. Here we go. Matthew 16, starting in verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. This is a really important passage. Up to this point, there were hints, of course, all over the place to anyone paying attention that Jesus was the Messiah promised in the Old Testament, promised by Isaiah 53, promised by Daniel chapter 7. Isaiah chapter 7. There are hints all over the place that that's who Jesus was. But as of yet, it was not public knowledge. People didn't really put the pieces together quite yet. So as far as they're concerned, they think maybe he's just one of the prophets. This is the first surefire declaration by Peter, no less. You are the Christ. That's the Greek term for the Hebrew word Messiah. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay. Now, there are a few things worth digging into here a little bit. Let's start with the phrase that's in the question, the initial question, the phrase Son of Man, because that's an odd one. So in verse 13, he starts out by asking, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Now, obviously, he's referring to himself, because later on in verse 14, he says, who do people say that I am? It's a parallel statement. So he's asking about himself, and he's calling himself Son of Man. Now, what does that mean? Why does he use that phrase? Because that's unusual. Now, really, it's actually a Hebrew idiom. If you know what an idiom is in English language, it's a saying that is not meant to be taken at face value. It means something else. So when it says Son of Man, it's an idiom that simply means human. Okay? It means human. This is actually the word that's used in Numbers chapter 23, verse 19, contrasting God versus man, Son of Man. It just means human, right? Literally, the phrase is actually son of Adam. Okay, son of Adam. If you've ever seen or read the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis's series, that's what the Percival children are referred to as, right? Either a daughter of Eve or a son of Adam. It's the same kind of idea, just a human. But as the Old Testament progresses, that idiom takes on a deepened meaning. Ezekiel, for instance, in Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 1, is the first time we see Ezekiel referred to as the Son of Man. So there's some maybe reference to that role of Ezekiel's role as a prophet in saying that. But even deeper than that, in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, we see that it is one like a son of man who is supposed to descend and take on God's eternal kingdom and establish it here on the earth, which is the role of the Messiah, right? So that phrase, Son of Man, becomes synonymous with the messianic promise, with the promise in the Old Testament that one day there would be this Messiah come to save Israel from their sin, to establish this new eternal Davidic kingdom. And so that's what he's referring to, right? Now, one of the things you might notice is that phrase stands in contrast to what Peter says later on. In verse 16, Peter doesn't use the phrase Son of Man, he uses the phrase Son of the living God. Now, which one is it? Is he the Son of Man or is he the Son of God? And the answer, of course, is yes. He is the Son of Man, and he also is the Son of God. So that's just a little bit of info on that and why that phrase appears so many times in the Gospels. One of the other things you might notice is the way that he was perceived by the public. Now, I find this immensely fascinating because many times when we think about how Jesus is perceived, either was perceived or even is perceived by the modern world, a lot of times the way that I hear him portrayed is almost like, kind of an ancient hippie. He's just coming to spread the love, man, and that's what he's doing. And, he did. I mean, he did come and he loved everybody that he comes across. He cares about their souls, right? But you know what he also does? He also calls out sin wherever that might be, even if it's in the highest echelons of society, right? Which is why primarily people didn't associate him with some light-hearted, laid-back guy. They associated him with who? People like John the Baptist, who called out Herod for his improper marriage to his sister-in-law. That's in Mark chapter 6, verse 18. People like Elijah, who in 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 10, calls down fire from heaven to consume the armies of the king. People like Jeremiah, who we read about earlier, prophesied about the the destruction of the king and all of Israel because of their sin. That's who he was identified with. They didn't think he was laid back. No, they saw him as this very anti-authority figure, right? And that's interesting. So, notably, though, as I mentioned before, there is not yet this widespread belief about him as the Messiah, about him as we understand him today, right? They didn't understand that yet. That was not widespread yet. Now, let's talk about Peter's confession. What does Peter say? Jesus turns this question to them and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, when he uses that phrase, Son of God, I don't think Peter understood the gravity of what he was saying. Normally, when we think about Son of God today in the church, we often think about that in a Trinitarian sense. He was the Son of God in the sense that he is the Son of the Father, one of the three, of Father, Son, and Spirit. I don't think that's, I'm going to take a sip here of coffee that I've brought. There we go. I don't think Peter had that kind of understanding of Jesus quite yet. Now, I think it's absolutely true. Jesus is the Son of God in that sense. But I think when he says Son of God, I think he's referring to him in the sense that Psalm 2 refers to David. So in Psalm chapter 2, in one of David's own Psalms, he is the king of Israel, and he refers to himself as what? Son of God. In Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. Now, when he says the living God, well, that's interesting too, because here Jesus is, God in the flesh, living before him, right? And I think that that's something that gives hope to a world that maybe was largely spiritually dead, right? You have a living God there in their midst. And Jesus says something important about this revelation as well. He says, this is not something that you have come up with all on your own. This is something that was revealed to you by God. This lines up with a passage we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 3. And I want to read it to you because I don't want to get it wrong here or missay it. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 3, how does it put it? I'm skipping pages. Here we go. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking in the Spirit of God ever says Jesus is accursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except in the Holy Spirit. So nobody comes to understand that Jesus is who he says he was except by God revealing that to us, right? So God revealed to Peter, this is who Jesus really is, right? This isn't something of his own contriving. He said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Su ho Christos ho huios tu theou tu zontos. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, right? Now, he talks about, what's Jesus' response to this? Well, it's twofold. First of all, Jesus gives kind of a counter-confession. So Peter, remember the phrasing, he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and Jesus says, and truly I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Now, people have argued for centuries over what exactly this means. I think the answer is actually pretty simple, straightforward. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 9, Peter, among others, James and John, are referred to as pillars of the church. The word that's used there is a pillar, like a pillar part of a building that would typically be made of stone. You may have heard that Peter also refers to a rock, and that's true. There's kind of a play on words there. So he's saying that Peter is partly the rock, but I think others were as well. I think he's really just talking simply about the crucial role that Peter's going to play in the days of the early church. And that's certainly true. If you look at the book of Acts, if you read through the book of Acts, you see what a pivotal role Peter had in the transition of the movement of the gospel from the Jewish people out to the Gentile population. particularly in Acts chapters 10 and 11, and then into chapter 15. So that's my take on it. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but as best as I can tell, that's what it refers to, his central role in the days of the early church. We see, by the way, in Acts chapter 5, 12 through 16, that all of the apostles, not just Peter, but many of the apostles were performing signs and wonders, were held in esteem by all who were present there outside Solomon's portico. Yeah, you can read about that. So anyway, moving on. He also goes on to say, and I think this is really, really important, he says that the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Most of your translations, including the ESV, will say the gates of hell. That's how we typically translate the word Hades. So Hades, or Hades, referred to the land of the dead. If you ever are reading the Old Testament and see the word Sheol, it's the same word, but that's the Hebrew word for it. So Sheol, Hades, it's the land of the dead. So when he says the land of the dead will not prevail against it, again, kind of another idiom, he's essentially saying the church will never die. Now, there was this idea in Jewish mysticism at the time, and this wasn't, it was kind of a niche idea. This wasn't something that everybody necessarily believed, but there was this common understanding that the temple, the Jerusalem temple of Israel, the second temple that was rebuilt after the first one, Solomon's, was destroyed, this was the meeting place of the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. Now, accompanied with that, there were some Jewish mystics that also thought that this is where the land of Hades met the land of earth, or excuse me, the realm of earth and the realm of heaven. So they all kind of converged on this one central point. And so you have almost this image of the gates of Hades beaming up and kind of protruding on the land of the living, and even getting close to the land of the realm of heaven. And Jesus' message here is it's never going to win. And this is so crucial because there are so many times when we are convinced as Christians that things are going on in the world and the church, we're just not going to make it. We're not going to survive. We're not going to last. But what does Jesus say? He says the gates of hell will never prevail against it. It's okay. Now, that's not to say that we don't have our battles. That's not to say that we don't have things we have to fight against, because we certainly do, but it will never win. Right? It will never win. It will be here until Jesus himself returns, and we should take comfort in that. I think maybe the biggest lesson of all, though, comes in verse 15. In verse 15, we see Jesus, he flips the question around. At first, he says, what does everybody else think about this? Who do people say that I am? And so they give the options, right? But then in verse 15, he flips it back to them. He says, but who do you say that I am? And I think that reflects something very true and profound. Not just about then, not just about right now, but about the future. Because one day, you're going to stand before the throne of God, and it's not going to matter what everybody else thought. It's not going to matter what other neighbors' opinions were. It's not going to matter what other people, the way that they live their lives. It's going to matter, what did you say? What do you think? You're going to have to give an answer to that question, right? Now, I mentioned before, we live in a postmodern society. And part of postmodernism, which has just generally pervaded our culture and society, part of postmodernism is questioning authority. That's kind of the core of it. But embedded in that questioning of authority is questioning, what we know, what we grew up with, questioning, these people say this, but are they just saying that because they have some ulterior motive, or is it actually true? We like to question things, right? And sometimes in that land of indecisiveness, in that land, the whirlwind of possibilities, we don't like to actually make up our mind. We like to stay there in that realm of options because that's what's most comfortable, and that's what's least likely to cause offense. We don't like to offend people. And by the way, as Christians, we shouldn't go out of our way to offend people, certainly. That's not what Jesus did. So when we see this kind of indecisiveness, a lot of that is well-intentioned because we don't want to say that something is definitively true, because by doing that we might be hurting other people's sensibilities or their beliefs. We might be stepping on their toes, right? But if we don't make a decision for ourselves, that's where it gets really dangerous. You may have heard of Robert Oppenheimer. There's actually a movie made about him, released, was it last year or the year before, just called Oppenheimer. Really fascinating. So Julius Robert Oppenheimer, he was born in New York City in April of 1904. 1925, he graduated from Harvard with a degree in chemistry. 1927, just a couple years later, he got his doctoral degree in physics from Göttingen University in Germany. By 1936, he was a professor at UC Berkeley, specializing in quantum mechanics. In 1942, because of his background in education, he was recruited by the U.S. government to begin work in a very secret way, of course, on the Manhattan Project, so the development of the nuclear bomb. And so he became the director of the Los Alamos Trinity Project that worked on developing and then eventually testing the world's first nuclear bomb. And on July 16th, 1945, they ran a successful test and got the results they expected. There was somebody, by the way, I think it was his own brother, that was there at the test and recorded it after it exploded and everything worked. He's quoted as saying, "Well, I guess it worked." And it did. Just a few weeks later, August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay aircraft drops Little Boy, the nickname for the bomb, on Hiroshima, the Japanese city, as we were at war with them in the Pacific Theater. When that bomb dropped, immediately killed about 50,000 people in and around the city. In the days leading after that, about 3 times that number ended up passing away. And then 3 days later, a very similar scene in Nagasaki, where the second nuclear bomb was dropped. Now, the whole process in this, Oppenheimer was wrestling with the ethics of it all, right? And this was most evident later on when he got involved with the Atomic Energy Commission. And what he actually advocated is, he said, we should not go any further with this research. We should not do this anymore because we're going to create an even more dangerous weapon, namely the atom bomb. So there was an interview with Oppenheimer years later, and the reporter was asking him whether he thought the bombing was justified. And initially, he had this idea that, well, this is for the greater good. This is for the greater good. I mean, yeah, there are some people that are going to get hurt, but long term, this is going to save a lot of lives, right? Save even more lives than the lives that might be lost in the bombing. But, and that is a hard pill to swallow. So this reporter asks him, do you think the bombing was justified? And he starts out by giving all of these different opinions within the scientific community about what they thought. And she said, okay, but what do you think? And he thinks about it for a second, and he walks away. He doesn't answer the question. There are some questions that you can't walk away from. There's going to be a day, nobody else, just you before the throne of God, and it's not going to matter what other people thought. It's not going to matter what other people thought about what you think. It's just not. The question is going to be posed to you, but who do you say that I am? And frankly, the life that you live right now, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this, the life that you live right now, whether you intend for it to be or not, your life is a testimony to your answer to that question as to whether or not you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So you've got to answer that, and you've got to figure out what you believe. I know what I believe. I believe that Jesus is Lord, and I'd be willing, by the way, I'd be willing to explain why I believe that to any one of you if you want to get in touch with me. I can tell you why I believe that. And maybe that's not why you believe it. Maybe there are different reasons. Maybe there are some challenges to your belief that maybe I don't have, but I'd be glad to share that with you. One last passage I'll read to you. This is from 1 Kings chapter 18. 1 Kings 18, 21. This is the words of Elijah. He's confronting the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And this is what he says to them. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. They didn't have the courage to give an answer. And all of us are going to have to give an answer, right? We're all accountable to that. And we really need to take that seriously. What else matters in this life more than your answer to that question? And I mean that seriously. You know, we touched on this a few weeks ago, but I just want to re-impress that. What matters more? I don't think there is anything. Before we go, I want to tell you about some of the resources that we have to offer to our listeners. We have a Bible correspondence course that's published by the World Bible School. If you want to participate in that, go to worldbibleschool.org online, and you can find out how to get started there. If you need a Bible, we also have those offered to all of our listeners. Just send us something either by mail or contact us on our website. Our mailing address is up on the screen. It's P.O. Box 372. That is in Marquette, zip code 49855. You can also find a lot of this information on our website at letthebiblespeak.net. You can search Let the Bible Speak UP on any one of those apps you see up there, and you can listen to these episodes and as well as watch them on YouTube by searching the same name. Again, thank you for joining me today. I pray that you have an answer to the question by the end of today. May God bless you. Have a wonderful week. May God bless you in all that you do.